Okay, first step. I want you guys to navigate to this location. This is where I dropped in a site file for you. Okay, so it's up to you if you want to change it or if you just want to go with the standard site file for the final. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to throw in any requirements for modifying the site file or if you'll just work with this one. But for today and for this assignment, this is the one I want you to use. So go to the pre-rendering exhibit. And you'll notice a few things. There's a folder for textures, which don't worry about that. I was just trying something. In fact, I should probably delete that. And then there's this thing called class site model. If you open that up, you'll have to open read only. This is kind of just a quick sample. And for those of you who took my rendering class, you've seen this because we used it. Well, basically, this is roughly the size of most typical urban grids. It's like 200 feet by 800 feet or something like that, or at least that's what they have in Manhattan. So that's kind of what I emulated here. But I think it was 200 feet. I might have gone smaller than that. But anyway, the key here is we need to drop our building into it. So what I've done on my file, and I'm not going to exhaustively go through the whole process with you on how to bake and put things on a layer. I'll give you a brief preview of that, but generally speaking, I already have my model ready to go, and it's right here. Okay, so we have our Grasshopper file. Oops, there we go. And what I did was I set up a bunch of layers, and I didn't really name them here. I probably should have, but we have things like glass, and then we have louvers. The more clear you are about your layering, the easier it's going to be. Like this one was the core, that kind of stuff. So that's going to be easier if you spend time setting up your layers so that when you go into your definition and you need to bake all of your glass, for instance, that's these, you can go to bake, and then you can click on glass, and it's going to go to the proper layer. Okay, that's very, very important. Okay, the other thing that I did here is make a copy of my building after I baked all the appropriate layers. So I went through every single one of these elements, and I grabbed my boundary volumes here, grabbed those right there, and it might take some tracking down of the different elements that you need to bake out. And in fact, it took me like 5 or 10 minutes to figure out where my glass was. But once you find it, it's easy. So that just made all of my elements right here. So these now live in Rhino. After I was done baking it, I just selected it all, copied it over, and made it a group. Okay. You actually, in some cases, can move it over. Just make sure you deselect your rail curves that you made the original geometry off of. So anyway, after that, you just go back into the other model. This is your site model now. And when you... Oh, I didn't copy it again. Hang on. Let's see. Copy. And then go back into your site model, and then Control V. What? I thought I copied it.
Zoom out.
What's that?
What about if you zoom out?
It should be a... No. There we go. So on your file, it should come in roughly the same location. So it's really as simple as just grab the file, or grab the model, put it where you want to put it, and then set up your camera view and get ready to render. So I located mine something like this, and then I just moved my camera down here and started to figure out what I was going to do, what render view I was going to take. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to figure this out. The one other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the lens angle. So most lens angles are either, I mean, for the most part, we have a tendency to either put too flat of an image with too high of a millimeter lens, or we have too accentuated or stretched or warped of an image because we've gone too low on the lens angle. So just quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with what lens angle does? All right. So lens angle essentially just takes the light. It's a photography concept, and it just takes the light that comes into the lens and it bends it in a different way that will either stretch the proportions of your image in perspective, or it will flatten it out and make it closer to like a parallel projection. Okay, so that's found under properties when you have no geometry selected, and you look at your viewport properties. It's right here under camera. Okay, so when you're kind of floating around here and you realize, oh, I can't see my whole building, one of the it's like, oh, I really want to be here, but I can't see it all. One of the options you have is you can pull your lens length out. Generally speaking, 35 millimeter is the closest millimeter lens to the human eye. So that is something that you should keep in mind as a baseline where you might want to begin. But you can go up to 50 if you want it to be a little bit flatter, or you can go down to something like 22 if you want it to be a little more extreme. You can actually kind of get down on the street level and look up at it with a wide angle lens, make it more dramatic. Or if you're going to get really crazy, you can go down to something like a 15. And that's where you see, like when you're apartment hunting and you take a look at images that kind of looks like you're almost looking at it in a fishbowl. Well, that's because they popped in a really low millimeter lens in order to make the room look bigger by distorting it. So, yeah, tricks of the trade. All right, so anyway, 35 is probably what you're going to want to go with, and you're probably going to want to pick a semi-aerial, semi-distant view, and yeah, that's what I landed on, was something approximately like that.
So what about like the 1/3 section cuts?
For something like this, because it's like an iconic, it depends. Depends what kind of context you're putting up. Like this site model is clearly a central focus site model, right? There's nothing else that I'm trying to communicate in this render except for the building. So in that case, it's perfectly fine to put it in the center of the frame. But if you have some other interesting things that you're trying to put in there, like, I don't know, maybe you want to see the relationship of this building to these other closest buildings, then you would want to try and frame it so that you've got something on the third lines. Do any of you guys know what the rule of third is? Raise your hand if you do. Yeah. All right, so quick,
Materials class, what?
very quick lesson on what rule of thirds is. When you're setting up renders, you want to pay close attention to where things are in your frame, and generally speaking, we have this natural tendency to want to put everything in the center of our frame. That's not always the best case. In fact, it's frequently not the best case. So this is what I mean here. If you sort of offset the focus of your image and you align this with 1/3 of the way across your image, it makes for a more natural feeling point of view, I think, is kind of the general description that I would use. But it also, it gives you an opportunity to activate other parts of your render. Because if you put your building in the dead center of the render, generally everything else in the image just falls off with equal amount of disinterest. But if you accentuate it by moving your building off to the side and showing a few other things, then it becomes about a relationship of two things, and there's a lot more that you can do with that. Does that make sense? So, but for this exercise, I'd say you don't really have to worry about it too much, because what we're doing with A, this exercise now, and B, our final, is we're developing iconic structures. And when the concept is to focus on such an element, then it's okay to use the center line, I think. What questions do you have? All right, let's set up a render.